France just lost a $3 billion grip in one stroke. One decree, one young captain's pen, and decades of Paris's stability went up in smoke. They said it was protection, but protection that locks half your savings in someone else's vault? That's not a shield. That's a leash with a nice logo. And here comes the kicker. Cutting the CFA franc isn't just about money. It's about soldiers packing bags, garrisons shutting down, and a brand new gamble on the eco, a dream currency that could unite 15 nations, or sink before the ink dries. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's your daily habit when it comes to money? Do you trust banks, keep cash, or something else? Your story might sound a lot like Africa's Gamble today. This is Africa Daily Good News, a channel built to tell Africa's turning points in our own voice, but clear enough for our friends across America, Europe, and everywhere to follow the drama. If you believe these stories matter, hit subscribe, tap that like, and share this with someone who still thinks colonialism ended in the 60s. And now, let's step into the real story. Not just numbers and decrees, but the chain France thought would never break. Imagine waking up and realizing half of your nation's savings don't even exist in your own country. They sit in a vault in Paris, untouchable, while your children line up for classrooms with no desks and farmers beg for price relief that never comes. That's the paradox Captain Ibrahim Traoré called out when he tore open the old file stamped 1945, the birth certificate of the CFA franc. For nearly 80 years, this currency shaped the fate of 14 African states, including Burkina Faso. It was marketed as stability, but stability came with a price. Every member had to deposit around 50% of its foreign reserves directly into the French treasury. In return, the CFA franc could be exchanged at a fixed rate with the French franc, and later the euro. Supporters praised it as a shield against inflation. Yet, however, what good is a shield if the handle isn't in your grip? Could Ouagadougou ever cut interest rates to help farmers when cotton prices crashed? Could leaders devalue their currency to push exports? The answer, over and over again, was no. The numbers are cold, but the memories are not. In the late 1980s, when global cotton prices collapsed, Burkinabe farmers pleaded for relief. Instead of policy flexibility, they got silence from Paris boardrooms. One old farmer told Traoré during a dusty market visit, "We worked the fields, but Paris decided the price of our sweat." That sentence carried more weight than any IMF report. And here's where the twist hits harder. The CFA franc didn't just manage exchange rates, it managed pride. In January 1994, families across West Africa woke up to find their savings slashed by half overnight. A 50% devaluation signed in Paris, not in Africa. No local parliament, no local consent. Stability dressed itself as domination, hiding behind technical jargon. Think about it. If you're an American viewer, would you accept waking up tomorrow and finding your dollars cut in half because another country decided so? Most people would riot in the streets. Yet in West Africa, this was packaged as policy. It's easy to overlook currency when coins and notes look harmless. Wildlife and masks printed on bills, monuments etched in color, artwork that celebrated African identity. But beneath the surface, every coin whispered dependency. Each bill carried the echo of a leash stretched across the Mediterranean. People knew it. Market women counting change knew it. Gold miners paid in CFA knew it. And Ibrahim Traoré knew it. He wasn't just talking about economics. He was talking about memory, about domination so quiet that many forgot to call it what it really was. Here's the human contradiction. Independence was celebrated in 1960. Flags rose, anthems played, but the backbone of sovereignty, the money itself, remained tied to Europe. It's like moving out of your parents' house but giving them full control of your bank account. You can decorate your own living room, but you can't decide how much food to put on your table. This is why the story of the CFA franc is not just about numbers. It's about whether a nation can breathe freely when its lifeblood still flows through someone else's veins. And when Traoré finally picked up his pen, the question hanging over the room was brutal. How much longer can a country pretend to be free if its currency still bows to a foreign capital? The CFA franc was never just a currency. It was a quiet hand pressing down on every field of cotton, on every bar of gold, on every small market stall in Burkina Faso. Traoré closed the dusty file, the air thick with history, and outside the palace window the city pulsed as if holding its breath. Freedom was written on paper, but in the streets, people still wondered if it could ever be cashed in. One pen stroke can silence a parliament louder than any gun. On April 8, 2025, Ibrahim Traoré rose in the presidential hall and signed a decree that startled two continents at once. Burkina Faso would abandon the CFA franc, and French troops had until September to pack their flags and leave. In a single morning, a small West African nation told Paris, "Your money and your soldiers are no longer welcome." The room froze. Some ministers erupted in applause, others stared at the floor as if the ceiling might collapse. Could a country that still imports 60% of its goods survive without the safety net of French backing? Could farmers who trade daily in CFA bills trust a newborn currency? The questions hung in the air, heavier than celebration. Yet outside, the news spilled through radios in crowded markets, where women embraced strangers and students broke into song. It looked like liberation, but under the noise of drums came the whisper of fear. Think about this for a second. When Americans debate the Federal Reserve raising interest rates by half a point, Wall Street shakes. Now imagine waking up and learning your entire currency, your savings, your salaries, your contracts, was ending in a matter of months. For Burkinabe citizens, that wasn't a debate on CNBC, it was an announcement on state radio. In a cafe near Ouagadougou's Kwame and Nkrumah Avenue, an old man tapped his cup and muttered, "I waited 50 years for this day. But if the new franc collapses, how do we buy bread?" His son, sitting across, answered quietly, "Better hungry and free than fed in chains." That generational divide captured the gamble perfectly. One saw risk in empty shelves, the other saw dignity finally unchained. Most Americans would understand the instinct. Surveys often show people value freedom of choice almost as much as financial security. Yet, when both collide, which side wins? The decree didn't just echo inside Burkina Faso. In Paris, officials pounded tables over billions of African reserves sitting in French coffers. Was this sabotage or justice delayed by 80 years? Across West Africa, neighbors held their breath. Leaders in Côte d'Ivoire feared the spark of contagion. Nigeria cautiously praised sovereignty while Dakar warned of instability. And in Washington, think tanks, analysts whispered, if one small nation breaks the colonial grip, how many others follow? Here lies the paradox. Removing foreign troops was framed as regaining sovereignty, yet it exposed the same borders those troops once patrolled. Without French air cover, could the Burkinabe army guard its northern frontier against insurgents? General Staff warned of gaps. Traoré's reply was blunt. "Our soldiers fight harder for land that is truly theirs." That line became a headline, but also a test. Pride can fill a square with chance. It cannot fill fuel tanks or keep food prices down. The tension built like a drumbeat. On one side, the roar of independence. On the other, the quiet dread of inflation. Ministers shuffled papers, traders worried about conversion rates, and mothers wondered what tomorrow's market would charge for rice. Freedom had been signed with ink, but survival would be written in numbers. Outside the palace that night, torchlight flickered across Independence Square. Faces lit with pride, yet shadows of doubt stretched long. In that uneasy glow, the nation waited, neither fully celebrating nor retreating, just bracing for what might come next. How do you replace a broken chain with something that actually holds? That was the question the morning after Traoré's decree. Ending the CFA franc wasn't just subtraction. It demanded addition, something new, something that could convince traders, farmers, and international markets all at once. The answer whispered across conference tables was the EU's, a long-delayed dream of a single West African currency. On paper, the ECO sounded simple. 15 nations under ECOWAS trading in one coin. No conversion fees, no dependence on Paris. The rules looked clear. Keep inflation under 10%, debt under 70% of GDP, and reserves covering at least 3 months of imports. Burkina Faso, at least for now, ticked some boxes. Inflation around 2.3%, debt manageable at 50% of GDP, reserves close to 5 months. It looked solid, however, numbers alone don't guarantee trust. Markets run on psychology as much as policy. In a bustling cloth market in Bobo Dioulasso, a trader beamed, "With eco, I can sell directly to Nigeria without losing to conversion fees." That optimism is contagious, like an entrepreneur in New York celebrating when new tax cuts open a market. But then, across the aisle, a fishmonger shook her head. "If eco fails, who covers our losses? My stall cannot eat promises." Two voices in the same market, one seeing opportunity, the other fearing collapse. That tension is the heartbeat of this gamble. And here's the irony. The eco has been promised since the year 2000, yet even the regional giants, Nigeria, Ghana, still hesitate. If they drag their feet, can a smaller state like Burkina Faso afford to leap first? Most Americans understand the fear of being the early adopter. We love innovation, but as surveys often show, the majority prefer to let someone else test the product before jumping in. In West Africa, though, delay has already cost decades. Traoré's stance was clear. Leadership means moving first. If we wait for everyone, we will wait another 80 years. There's a twist hidden in those words. Boldness can inspire others, but it can also isolate. If Burkina Faso rushes into eco before neighbors commit, the new currency could stumble before it learns to walk. That's why every speech about eco quickly expands beyond numbers. It becomes a story about sovereignty, about whether Africa can finally keep value inside its own borders instead of bleeding it into foreign treasuries. And here's where you come in. Do you believe a shared African currency could work? Or do you think it risks repeating the same mistakes, just with a new logo on the bills? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read them all, and your perspective adds to this conversation. Meanwhile, in Brussels, officials grumbled about losing influence. In Washington, analysts warned that eco might weaken the dollar's grip in African trade. In Beijing, officials smiled quietly, already sketching out new partnerships. Everyone sees eco not just as a currency, but as a battlefield of influence. The struggle is local, but the ripples are global. Back in Ouagadougou, ministers pored over files stamped convergence criteria. Their fingers traced numbers, but their minds wrestled with something deeper. Could pride survive the arithmetic of deficits? Could dignity withstand the cold eye of investors? Outside those halls, traders still argued in the markets, their words sharper than the economists' charts. The eco wasn't yet in their hands, but it was already shaping their fears and hopes. The night fell warm over the capital, and lights shimmered across Independence Square. In that glow, the eco felt less like a ledger entry and more like a wager scribbled on the future. And as people carried their doubts and their dreams back to their homes, a different question loomed, waiting in the shadows. Who would protect this fragile experiment when the soldiers who once patrolled under a foreign flag were gone? What happens when the shield you've depended on for decades suddenly vanishes? For Burkina Faso, the withdrawal of French forces wasn't just a political statement, it was the beginning of an open question about survival. Paris had claimed for years that its troops guaranteed stability in the Sahel. Yet villages kept burning, markets were still raided, and convoys carrying gold somehow always had protection when hamlets did not. That contradiction cut deep, and Traoré used it as fuel. When French convoys rolled out quietly in early 2023, bases that once buzzed with foreign drones and Mirage jets went silent. Operation Barkhane's departure was celebrated in the streets of Ouagadougou, but in the north, residents asked the harder question: if the outsiders leave, who fills the gap? Some generals warned of porous borders and exposed frontiers. Traoré's response was blunt. Our soldiers fight harder for land that is truly theirs. To some, that sounded like defiance. To others, it was simply risky optimism. The shift forced a reckoning. Burkina Faso could no longer rely on borrowed intelligence or air support. The plan that followed was twofold: build an independent spine and craft new alliances. Local factories in Ouagadougou began assembling rifles, radios, even uniforms. Special forces units were doubled, and procurement lists suddenly emphasized reconnaissance craft to be owned, not loaned. But here's the twist. Building strength at home strained budgets that were already stretched thin. Every weapon produced meant one less clinic funded, one less school repaired. This was sovereignty paid in installments. And while the government built its own arsenal, regional ties tightened. In late 2023, Burkina Faso joined Mali and Niger in the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, a pact promising joint patrols, intelligence sharing, and coordinated strikes against insurgents. On dusty border towns, commanders from 3 armies traced new patrol lines across maps once marked by French command centers. For the first time, the Sahel's defense was being drawn by African hands. But alliances carry shadows too. Turkish Bayraktar drones appeared in talks, Moscow pushed artillery and trainers, Beijing whispered about encrypted surveillance systems. The offers glittered, but each came with a price. One leash risks being replaced by another. Here's where the human layer sharpens the picture. A shopkeeper in Kaya once told a journalist, "I used to see French soldiers pass by, but when the market was attacked, they never returned. At least if my own nephew in uniform is sent, I know he's fighting for us." That sentence cuts through statistics better than any policy memo. It reminds us that security isn't just measured in bases or patrols. It's measured in whether families feel safer walking to market. And if we're honest, most societies wrestle with this balance. Americans often argue whether safety should come from government surveillance or from communities policing themselves. Research even shows that people accept higher risks if they feel ownership over the decision. The same logic applies in Burkina Faso. Many would rather live under fragile protection that is theirs than under strong protection that belongs to someone else. By mid-2024, new commando units were already drilling in the bush, AES patrols were intercepting smugglers, and Burkinabe gendarmes were guarding gold mines with urgency, knowing the entire budget depended on their defense. Yet the more progress appeared, the heavier the weight became. Could this momentum survive insurgencies, sanctions, and shortages all pressing at once? One evening, as the sun bled across the Sahel, Traoré walked the corridors of a former French barracks. The walls still bore faded tricolor paint, a ghost of guardianship past. He stopped, resting his hand on the cold concrete, and murmured, "Stability without dignity is only silence in uniform." Outside, the sky turned a deep red, hinting that the next battle would not be about history, but about who gets to write the new map of power. The day Paris left, new doors opened, but each door had a different lock. Without French troops in Ouagadougou and without the CFA franc in circulation, Burkina Faso had to redraw its map of friends. The new strategy wasn't isolation, it was multiplication. Traoré began turning east and south, away from Europe's shadow, toward a multipolar table where Africa could sit as a partner, not a subject. Russia offered artillery, energy deals, and training programs. China brought proposals for highways, rail lines, and digital networks. Brazil promised tractors and agricultural expertise. India put forward medicine and software skills. South Africa linked Burkina Faso to the African Continental Free Trade Area. For the first time, Ouagadougou's diplomatic calendar looked less like a one-way ticket to Paris and more like a crowded map of capitals from Moscow to Brasilia. But here comes the twist. Every promise carried both hope and hazard. Moscow asked for loyalty, Beijing wrapped contracts in fine print, and even friendly African states hinted at conditions. Traoré's rule was simple. Command stays in Ouagadougou. The message sounded strong, yet history shows how easy it is for new chains to disguise themselves as partnerships. Americans might recognize the same dilemma when debating foreign investments in their own infrastructure. Is it just capital, or a subtle claim of influence? Inside a former French barracks, ministers gathered around maps now covered not with troop positions but with trade routes and pipelines. One official read aloud, "Russia offers helicopters, India offers pharmaceuticals, Brazil sends technicians." The list sounded like opportunity. Yet another minister leaned back and asked, "Can 20 million people manage this many deals at once without being swallowed whole?" That question echoed the fear many Burkinabe carried quietly. Prosperity could come, but at what cost? A short story illustrates the tension. In Bobo Dioulasso, a farmer walked visitors past new Brazilian soy fields, proud that rotation techniques promised bigger harvests. But then he whispered, "If the buyers set the price, what difference does it make if the nameplate says France, China, or Brazil?" His doubt revealed the human side of geopolitics. Dignity is not just about who funds the seeds, but about who controls the harvest. And maybe that's the deeper layer here. According to studies on consumer behavior in the US, most people are more comfortable with companies they feel they understand, even if the deal is worse. That's why some Americans pay more to buy local. Burkina Faso now faces the same psychological puzzle. Are new partners truly different or simply foreign with better branding? On the global stage, though, the shift was impossible to ignore. In Moscow, diplomats discussed gold-backed trade. In Beijing, engineers sketched highways stretching from Ouagadougou to the coast. In Pretoria, South Africa framed Burkina Faso as a cornerstone of a second wave of African decolonization. Each handshake gave Traoré more room to maneuver, but each also risked new entanglements. And in the streets, people read these changes differently. Some saw pride, finally choosing partners without colonial memory. Others saw the danger of too many promises at once. The mood was both hopeful and cautious, like stepping into a new house whose foundations you haven't yet tested. If you've followed us this far, tell us in the comments. Would you trust new friends after being betrayed by old ones? Or would you stand alone no matter how hard the road? Your answer says as much about human instinct as it does about politics. Night fell over Ouagadougou as a convoy of diplomats prepared to fly out. Some to Moscow, some to Beijing, others to Brasilia and Delhi. The palace steps glowed under torches, and Traoré watched quietly. Once, Burkinabe leaders traveled to Paris for instructions. Now they travel to the world as equals. The question lingered in the heavy night air. Could a small landlocked country keep its balance on so many shifting scales? The next challenge wasn't in the handshake, it was in the math waiting on the other side. Pride doesn't pay for bread, but without pride, bread loses its taste. That was the paradox Burkina Faso faced once the euphoria faded. Cutting the CFA franc and sending French troops away created a new landscape where numbers mattered as much as slogans. Inflation stood at 2.3% in 2024, debt hovered near 50% of GDP, gold exports brought in over $3 billion, and cotton still supported nearly 2 million citizens. On paper, the economy looked stable. But stability on paper doesn't guarantee stability on the street. Shopkeepers in Ouagadougou counted their coins nervously, not because money had vanished, but because certainty had. Could a newborn currency hold when global markets are skeptical? Could the budget stretch when imports, fuel, medicine, technology still came mostly from outside? Ministers warned about deficits and sanctions, about Brussels tightening aid or Paris cutting trade. And yet, the counter-argument was simple. For decades, stability meant someone else's comfort, not the hunger of Burkinabe children. Here's where the story flips again. Building sovereignty requires more than rejecting outsiders. It requires creating new arteries of growth. Traoré's government pushed plans for rail lines, highways, and digital payment systems. Every new brick, every bridge, every fiber optic cable was described as a shield. Money without infrastructure is paper. Currency with roads is power. That line resonated because it turned economics into something visible, touchable. Americans often relate to this too. When highways were built under Eisenhower, they weren't just concrete. They were symbols of strength, unity, and reach. The same psychology applies in West Africa today. Still, human doubt lingers. In a small town outside Kaya, a teacher explained how her salary felt heavier after the decree, not because it grew, but because it now carried questions. Would her pay buy the same rice next month? Would inflation bite before the eco found its legs? Her story wasn't about theory. It was about walking home with a paycheck that felt like both victory and risk in the same envelope. And this is where global observers misread Africa's gamble. They see deficits, ratios, forecasts. But on the ground, it's about something more universal, whether people can look at their own currency and believe in it. According to research on consumer confidence in the US, most households spend more freely when they believe tomorrow will be secure, even if today's numbers are shaky. Belief drives markets as much as spreadsheets. Burkina Faso is betting on the same principle. The transition is fragile. If gold prices dip or cotton exports stumble, pressure builds. If neighbors hesitate to adopt eco, momentum wobbles. But pride, once awakened, is hard to put back to sleep. Independence was declared in 1960 with flags and anthems. Now it is being declared again with budgets and banknotes. Night settled over Ouagadougou, and chants of "Africa Rise" echoed across Independence Square. Soldiers painted the words on barracks walls, students wrote them on notebooks, market women whispered them as they gave change. The numbers may look cold, but the mood was heating. The gamble was real, but so was the dignity. And as torches lit the square, it became clear. The real test was no longer France's grip. It was whether Burkina Faso could hold its own future without letting it slip. So if you've watched this far, let us know. Would you choose fragile freedom over comfortable dependence? Drop your answer in the comments. And don't forget to share this video with someone who still thinks Africa can't write its own story. The story of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré is more than a headline. It's a test of whether a nation can trade chains for choices, and whether sovereignty can survive the pressure of markets, neighbors, and history itself. The CFA franc is gone, foreign garrisons are packing up, and the eco stands on the horizon. What comes next will measure not only Burkina Faso, but Africa's determination to rise on its own terms. If this journey moved you, make sure to subscribe to Africa Daily Good News so you don't miss the next chapter. Like this video, share it with friends, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We want to hear your perspective because every voice shapes how this story is remembered. And if you're ready to keep going, don't stop here. Our next story takes you deeper into Africa's shifting balance of power. Different players, same fight for dignity. Stay with us because history is still being written.